In the last video, I left off with me clamping up this leg base, and I think I left a picture at the end showing it like this, out of the clamps. I didn't sand any of these parts before I clamped it up, which was probably unusual, but I find that when you clean out the glue squeeze out in the corner here with the chisel, you might make some marks, and you're going to wind up sanding it anyway. So I make these little sanding blocks here. This is just a little piece of wood with double-sided tape on it, and I just stuck on some 220 grit sandpaper, and that allows me to get right in the corner here and sand with the grain all the way across. This doesn't take a lot because it's really smooth from the planer anyway. Sand all the way across and get right into the corner there, and because there's no sandpaper on here, I can get right in the corner and I can sand this little reveal here up and down, and that really cleans it up inside there. You can't see any glue squeeze out or anything like that. Okay, so that's how the sanding's gonna go on this. I'm not gonna do all of the sanding on this now. I just did that as a demonstration to show this little trick here and why I didn't sand all the parts before I put it together. I'm gonna wait until the end, after everything is assembled, but before I assemble the top part that has the drawers to the base here. And that way, you know, if it gets dinged up or anything happens to it in the meantime, then I don't have to spend time sanding it over again. So along with releasing this from the clamp yesterday, I also got the top and the bottom panels made for the upper part of the table. And what I used for this was a single piece of 2x12 that was well dried out. I think this is a 2x12 that I bought to build my stairs going down to the basement. That was how many years ago? 3 years ago for sure. So it's definitely well seasoned. So I cut it to length a little bit longer than it needed to be. And I actually changed out the blade in my bandsaw this time to resaw this, since I knew that the 1/4-inch blade would drift all over the place. But unfortunately, the blade that I put in wasn't in peak sharpness, that's for sure. It was actually starting to smoke. So I had to take a break from doing the cutting to sharpen that up. And then after it was sharp again, it whipped through the wood no problem. As you can see, when I'm nearing the end of this cut, the release of that drying stress that I talk about often, this piece was dead flat before I started cutting it. And then when the two halves released, they were cut pretty badly. Also, there's a crack here, and that goes through both pieces, but it doesn't go all the way up the board, so I decided that I would cut that out. Even with me cutting that out, the panels would still wind up being wide enough for me to use through the top and the bottom. So then I was going to run it through the planer, but then I decided that the knives that were in the planer were too dull, so I had to change those out. Another delay. But after that, it went smoothly through. I got nice clean cuts. And then I trimmed them perfectly square on my table saw / jointer and brought them over and clamped them up. When I clamped these ones up, I did use construction adhesive again. I knew that the joint would be really tight here, and I knew it would be nearly impossible to see because what I did was I just glued back the pieces that I cut the crack out of so that the grain lines up pretty good. I cut these too long to begin with, which is always a good thing to do when you're gluing up something like this. I'm just going to trim them down to the final width here on the miter saw. What I need to do now that I've got it cut to width is I want to bevel the edge. Now my old one over here had that cove cut in. That suits a more classical furniture design, and it's something that I don't want to do here. I want to have something that looks a lot more modern, so I'm just going to do that bevel. All right, I'm very happy with the way the bevel turned out on this one. It's nice and even. All it really needs is a little light sanding to clean it up. I'll do the top panel next, and the bevel is actually reversed. It goes on the underside on this one. And it's a little bit wavy this way, this panel, so I set up a feather board on my table saw to hold it tight in against the fence as I push it through. I've got a bit more machining to do on these panels before I can say they're finished, but before I do that, I want to sand the inside faces. This is the bottom, so it'll be the top. It goes up here. That's the face that I want to sand. And then the underside of the top. Next parts that I need to work on are the sides for the upper part. And I've got this piece of 2x10 that I'm going to cut down to about 7/8 of an inch thick, and then I'm going to plane it down to 3/4, and I'm going to get both panels, one on top of the other, out of this piece. So I've got the fence set to a little over 7/8 of an inch away from the blade, and I'll run it through and make that cut. Unfortunately, the blade was drifting too badly, so I had to abandon the fence and just cut it freehand. Okay, well, the blade did cut a little bit crooked there to start with. So, I don't know. Hopefully I made the panel overall long enough to avoid that little bit there. Otherwise, I'm going to wind up with a thinner panel. That's where plans change, right in the middle of the game. I couldn't get rid of all of it, unfortunately, but then it occurred to me that I really don't need to anyway, because this can be on the inside of the cabinet where the drawers are, and you'll never see it. Mainly because this panel is not wide enough on its own. It needs a piece to go on the front edge as well. And that'll do two things. It'll make the panel wider, first of all, and it'll also cover up dados that I want to cut through the side here to hold in strips that the drawers will ride on, actually. So I've got my saw set to 10 inches, and that'll be the overall height of the panels before I do any more milling on them. And of course, I'm also going to have to cut these to the final width. These boards are slightly cupped, so I'm holding them down tight to the table saw top as I push them through the saw. First thing I need to do is cut a dado in each piece that runs vertically, and that'll hold the back end, and that's 1/4 inch wide and 3/8 of an inch deep, and I'm just going to cut it by making passes with the regular saw blade. The next cuts are dados in the sides on the inside, and they're 1/4 inch thick and they're 1/4 inch deep, and what they'll do is they'll receive a strip that I'll put in there after, and I'll just glue it on the end in one place so that it'll allow the panel to expand and contract. And what they'll do is they'll support the drawers, very similar to the ones that are in my original that I did, except they'll be in there a little bit more solidly, I guess you could say. The next thing I have to do is I need to form a very thin tenon on the top and bottom of these. These will join to the top and bottom of the cabinet, you could say, with that tenon. And I've set my saw to 9 3/4, the fence away from the blade, and raised the blade up, made adjustments to cut, to leave just 1/8 of an inch here. And they'll be the same on both ends of both panels. All right, so those look pretty good. I just needed to do one other thing with them before I move any of this, and that's to shorten them up a little bit. I don't want them to go all the way to the ends, because that will mean that I'll have to cut a groove all the way into the end of the panels to accommodate them. So I'm going to run them into the saw by about 1/2 inch, and that'll remove just enough of the tongue. All right then, another tricky operation to do now. I need to cut the slot in the underside of this top panel. I'll do the same thing to the bottom panel as well, that these tongues will fit into. So I've set my fence 3/4 of an inch away from the blade, and I've raised it up to about 5/16 of an inch. I've marked the leading and the trailing edge of the blade on the fence here with pencil marks, and I've also made pencil marks up on the top of the panel that line up with the very edge of this bevel. This all sounds very complicated, but it'll make sense once I do it. So what I have to do is drop that in place on the running saw, cut my slot, take it up, do the same on the other side, and then I'll adjust the fence to make the slot wide enough for the tongue that's in the side panels. Okay, I got both panels done. A pretty tricky operation. Lots of opportunity to mess this up by cutting it too far, cutting it too wide, cutting it whatever. When in reality, all you need to do, if you have one, is use a biscuit joiner to cut a couple of biscuit slots, or 3, up in the top of this, same in the top and bottom panel, and put it together the same way. But no, we got to do it the hard way. So this is the way this goes. It'll slip right in there like that. Now I've got a problem with these panels. They are cupping pretty badly. I'm talking about a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch in the middle. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a relief cut right in the middle, and that'll allow it to flatten out. Yeah, that cut makes it a lot easier to straighten the panel. Takes a lot of the pressure off. Here at the back, it has to go out to the bevel here. So once again, I've got to round over the tenon, you could say. I'm just going to use my knife here just to cut a little bit off. That should be enough. I don't have to do any on the front because it's 1 inch back from the front, because I still have to put a piece on here. That'll slip in there like so, nice and tight. Like I mentioned before, I need to add another piece to the front of these side panels. This is exactly 1 inch wide and 3/4 of an inch thick, the same thickness as the side panels here. So what I need to do now is glue these on, clamp it up, and leave it until the glue dries before I can do anything else with this.